9 executives sat frozen in their seats as the cabin lights failed for the second time in 4 minutes, 30,000 feet above Richmond, Virginia. 40 minutes earlier, Desmond Cale had knelt beside the aircraft's rear panel at Ashcroft Aerospace's private hangar in Norfolk, Norfolk, and asked for 90 minutes to check 3 numbers that didn't add up. Renata Ashcroft, CEO of Ashcroft Aerospace, had checked her watch instead of his tablet. She had a merger signing in Washington in 3 hours, worth $240 million, and she was not going to let a subcontractor in a faded work jacket cost her the room. "Sign it or step aside," she told him. Desmond didn't sign it. Her own maintenance lead signed it in under a minute. Because Desmond refused, protocol required him to board the flight himself. Renata told her assistant to seat him in the last row, out of sight. Nobody argued. A few people smiled the way people smile when they think a problem has already been handled. What nobody noticed was the way the ground crew went quiet when they heard his name, or the way the captain, a man named James Voss, paused mid-briefing and asked, "Wait, Cale? That Cale?" Renata didn't hear it. She was already walking up the stairs, already rehearsing her pitch. Desmond called his daughter Nora before every job, the same as always. 4 minutes, nothing more. She was 19, studying aerospace systems on scholarship 3 states away, and she asked if he was heading off to fix something for people who wouldn't say thank you. He laughed and told her the aircraft didn't care whose name was on the ownership papers. Neither of them knew that in 50 minutes, a warning he tried to give on the ground would be the only thing standing between 15 people and a jet losing pressure at cruising altitude. If stories about quiet competence matter to you, stay close and consider subscribing. We take real time building these properly. The wheels lifted off the runway with 11 minutes left before the fault made itself known. The jet climbed through a gray ceiling of cloud, engine steady, cabin humming with the low murmur of 9 executives running through numbers for the Washington signing. In the last row, Desmond opened the aircraft's system feed on his tablet and watched 3 lines drift out of sync, just as they had on the ground, only faster now. He'd seen this pattern once before, years ago, on an aircraft most people at Ashcroft Aerospace had never heard him work on. A component that tested clean sitting still and failed only under real pressure at altitude. He asked the flight attendant to relay a message forward. The anomaly hadn't resolved. It was getting worse. The first officer checked his gauges and radioed back that everything read normal. Desmond asked for the captain directly. When James Voss opened the channel, there was no hesitation in his voice, only recognition. "Go ahead, sir." Renata, 3 rows up, turned at the word sir and frowned. She had never once heard anyone call the mechanic in the back row that. Desmond laid it out in 4 sentences. 3 systems behaving as one, the rate of drift increasing with altitude, the likely point of failure, and a warning: stop climbing until it's isolated. James went quiet for 3 seconds, then told his first officer to check the switchgear sequence by hand, something the checklist had never asked for because nobody had ever told him to look for it. They found the deviation in under a minute. Small, real. The cabin lights flickered once, held for a second, then steadied. Renata unbuckled and walked back toward the last row. She wanted to know why her captain was taking instructions from the man she told to sit down and stay quiet 3 hours ago. Before she reached him, the lights flickered again, longer this time, and somewhere behind the rear panel, a system that had been drifting all morning finally began to fail for real. If you've ever watched people scramble toward the one person they dismissed, stay close and consider subscribing. Stories built this carefully take time, and that's exactly why we never rush them. 6 minutes remained before scheduled cruising altitude.
The lights held their flicker a full 3 seconds, and this time nobody in the forward cabin went back to their phones. Desmond moved to the aft panel and pulled it open by hand. No permission asked, none needed anymore. What he found matched what the numbers had been suggesting since the hangar in Norfolk. The pressurization component wasn't the part Ashcroft Aerospace's own manuals called for. It was a substitute, built for a different thermal tolerance, one that read fine sitting still on a bench and only broke down once real altitude pressure pushed against it. James kept the descent slow and controlled, following instructions relayed back from a man he hadn't taken orders from in 11 years, not since a training program most people on this jet had never heard of. Renata stood in the aisle, arms folded, and asked James over the interphone why he was letting a subcontractor direct her flight crew. James didn't answer her the way she expected. He said, "Ma'am, Commander Hayes trained half the pilots on this side of the Atlantic. I'd take his word over a checklist any day." The word commander landed in that cabin like a dropped glass. A few executives turned in their seats. One of them, a man near the front, said quietly, "Wait, Hayes? That Hayes?" Nobody explained further. There wasn't time. The amber warning light steadied, then dimmed, then finally went dark as the isolation took hold. Renata looked at Desmond for a long moment. The tool bag, the worn jacket, the man she'd told her assistant to seat out of sight 3 hours ago, and said nothing at all. For the first time since the hangar, she didn't have a number, a deadline, or a lawyer standing between her and the truth in front of her. If you've ever watched someone realize in real time that they misjudged the wrong person completely, stay with this one. It only gets heavier from here. And if you'd like more stories built this carefully, consider subscribing. We take the time so the truth lands the way it should. The wheels touched down 9 minutes later. Nobody in that cabin exhaled in relief. They exhaled because they knew the real conversation was still waiting on the ground. A ground maintenance team from Ashcroft Aerospace met the jet on the tarmac in Richmond within 20 minutes, radios crackling before the stairs even dropped. Desmond stood beside the aft bay and pointed to the panel he'd already opened at altitude. The lead technician on the ground crew knelt down, looked at the part for a long moment, then looked up at Desmond with an expression that had nothing to do with rank. He said, "This isn't on our parts list. Where did this even come from?" Desmond didn't answer that. He wasn't the one who needed to. Renata stood a few feet back, arms crossed, watching her own people defer to a man she'd told to sit in the last row that morning. Nobody was performing for her benefit. The technician pulled the part free, turned it over, and read a supplier stamp none of them recognized. James, still in his captain's uniform, walked over and said quietly, loud enough only for Renata to hear, that in 11 years of flying, he had never once seen Desmond flag something that didn't turn out to be real. Not once. Renata's assistant approached with a phone already in her hand, the Washington office on the line asking whether the signing needed to be pushed back. Renata didn't answer right away. She was still looking at the mismatched part in the technician's palm, the same part Desmond had tried to explain to her in the hangar that morning in under 2 minutes before she'd checked her watch instead of listening. "Who approved this supplier?" she asked. Nobody answered immediately. The technician said it wasn't anyone on the certified vendor list he'd worked from in 3 years. Desmond finally spoke. "That's the question that matters now, not what failed. Who let it in?" Renata looked at him differently than she had that morning, the way someone looks at a person they never actually saw. Somewhere behind her, her legal counsel was already on his phone, voice low, urgent, already trying to get ahead of something he clearly understood before anyone said it out loud.
Renata's assistant pulled her aside near the tail of the aircraft and handed her a tablet, the maintenance procurement records already open on the screen. She scrolled through 3 months of purchase orders until she found the entry that didn't belong, a vendor code that had never appeared in any previous Ashcroft Aerospace filing. The purchase had been authorized by her legal counsel, Marcus Deering, 6 weeks earlier. The cost savings were listed at 31% below the certified supplier's quote, and the same figure had been written directly into the financial summary sent to the federal partners waiting on tonight's signature. Renata stared at the number for a long moment. 31%. Enough to matter on a spreadsheet. Enough, apparently, to matter more than a mechanic's warning in a hangar that morning. Renata called Marcus. He answered on the second ring, already talking before she said a word, telling her the part had passed every internal check, that the paperwork was clean, that this was a conversation for lawyers, not on a tarmac in Richmond. Desmond, standing a few feet away, said nothing. He didn't need to defend himself anymore. The mechanic had already photographed the mismatched component and logged it under a formal incident number, one that would now follow this aircraft, this vendor, and this decision through every file Ashcroft Aerospace kept. James approached quietly and told Renata something she hadn't asked for. 11 years ago, before he ever sat in a cockpit for Ashcroft Aerospace, he'd washed out of a federal training program on his first attempt. Desmond had pulled him aside after everyone else had given up on him and spent 6 unpaid weekends teaching him what the manuals didn't. James said he wouldn't be flying anything today if it weren't for that man standing by the tail of this jet. Renata looked at Desmond again, the tool bag now resting by his feet, and asked the question she should have asked in the hangar 11 hours ago. "Who exactly are you?" Before he could answer, her phone rang. The federal partners were calling, and they had already heard about the emergency landing. Renata answered the call and put it on speaker without thinking, right there on the tarmac, wind pulling at the edge of her jacket. The voice on the line belonged to Undersecretary Bill Farrow, one of the federal partners set to sign tonight. He didn't ask about the merger. He asked why an Ashcroft Aerospace jet had made an emergency descent into Richmond, and whether it was true that the aircraft had been flown out of a fault reported on the ground and overwritten before departure. Renata's assistant went pale. Marcus, still on his own call somewhere behind the hangar, went quiet enough that Renata could hear him through the open air, no longer arguing about paperwork. Farrow asked one more question, and it was the one that mattered. He asked who had caught the fault in the first place. Renata looked at Desmond. He hadn't moved from beside the tail of the aircraft, tool bag still at his feet, saying nothing, the way he'd said nothing in the hangar that morning when nobody wanted to hear him. "A subcontractor," Renata said, then stopped herself. She corrected it. "A commander, Desmond Hayes." There was a pause on the line, longer than expected. Then Farrow said something Renata didn't see coming. He said he knew that name. He'd sat in a briefing room 12 years ago where Desmond Hayes personally signed off on a safety protocol still used across 3 federal flight programs today. Renata turned to look at Desmond fully for the first time since the hangar, the way someone looks at a person after realizing they'd been standing next to something they never bothered to read. Farrow said the signing wasn't canceled, it was postponed 30 days, pending a full independent audit, an audit he wanted led by the one person on that tarmac who'd already proven he could find what everyone else missed. Renata lowered the phone slowly. Somewhere behind her, Marcus had stopped talking entirely. If you've ever watched the truth arrive exactly when someone least expected it, stay than one career. And if these stories matter to you, consider subscribing. We build them slowly because the truth deserves that.
Marcus reappeared from behind the hangar wall, phone still in his hand, and tried to insert himself back into the conversation before Renata had even lowered hers. He said the postponement was an overreaction, that the part had technically passed every check it needed to pass, that federal partners always looked for a reason to slow down a deal this size, and this was simply the excuse they'd been waiting for. Desmond spoke for the first time in several minutes. "It passed the checks you wrote, not the ones the manufacturer requires." Marcus turned toward him, and for the first time all day, there was something sharp in his voice instead of practiced calm. He said Desmond had no standing to comment on procurement decisions, that his job ended at the aircraft's technical bay. Renata's assistant, still holding the tablet with the purchase order open, spoke up quietly. She said the vendor code Marcus had approved didn't match anything in the certified supplier database, not because it was new, but because it had been rejected by Ashcroft Aerospace's own compliance office 8 months earlier, before Marcus brought it through a different channel. The tarmac went quiet. Renata asked Marcus directly if that was true. He didn't answer right away,
and the silence answered for him. James stepped in beside Desmond, arms crossed, and said the flight logs from the descent, along with every instruction Desmond had given him in real time, were already filed with the FAA under mandatory incident reporting. Nothing in that record could be quietly walked back. Marcus's expression shifted, the confidence draining out of it in a way Renata hadn't seen from him in the 4 years she'd worked for her. Renata looked at the tablet, then at Desmond, then at the aircraft behind them, still sitting on the tarmac with its aft panel open to the evening air. "I need every procurement decision Marcus has made in the last year, tonight." Her assistant nodded and started walking before Renata finished the sentence. Behind them, Marcus reached for his phone again, and this time his hands weren't steady. The board convened by video call that same night, screens lighting up across 4 time zones while the jet still sat on the tarmac in Richmond with its panel open. Renata didn't wait for her legal team to draft a statement. She spoke first, before anyone else could shape the story for her. She told the board the fault had been real, that she had overridden a documented warning before departure, and the component responsible had entered the company through a vendor Marcus Deering approved after compliance had already rejected it 8 months earlier. One board member asked who had caught the fault in time to prevent something far worse. Renata turned her laptop so the camera included the man standing quietly beside him, tool bag still at his feet, jacket still worn from a decade of work most people on this call had never bothered to ask about. "Commander Desmond Hayes," she said, "formerly of the Federal Flight Safety Program. He tried to tell me this morning, and I told him to sit in the back of the plane." Nobody on the call laughed. Nobody offered a correction. Bill Farrow, joining from the federal side, confirmed what he'd said on the tarmac. He'd sat in briefings 12 years ago where Desmond's safety protocols were adopted across 3 separate flight programs, protocols still active today. He said the independent audit would proceed, and he wanted Desmond leading the technical review, not as a favor, but because nobody else in that call had earned it the way he just had. Marcus tried to speak. The board chair cut him off and asked him to leave the call. Desmond said nothing through most of it. When Renata finally asked if he had anything to add, he said only one thing. The part that failed wasn't the real problem. The real problem was how long it took for someone with authority to believe the person who noticed it first. The board suspended Marcus from the project before the call ended. Renata looked at Desmond and asked quietly what it would take for him to stay on, permanently, not as a subcontractor. He hadn't answered yet when his phone buzzed. It was Nora, calling 4 hours later than usual, asking if he'd made it home safe.
Desmond stepped away from the group still gathered near the aircraft and answered on the second ring. Nora's voice was tight with worry, the kind she never let show unless something had genuinely scared her. She'd seen the flight tracker glitch, the diversion to Richmond, and no message from him for hours. He told her everything was fine, that there'd been a fault, that it was handled. He didn't mention the board call, or Marcus, or the word commander being said out loud in years. That wasn't a phone conversation. She asked if he was really okay, and he said yes, the way he always did, and for once it was completely true. The independent audit took 31 days. It confirmed everything that Tarmac and Richmond had already suggested. Marcus had steered 4 separate contracts to unapproved vendors over 2 years, each one justified by cost savings written into reports nobody outside his office ever checked closely. He resigned before the findings were made public. Ashcroft Aerospace removed every one of those vendors from its systems and rebuilt its compliance office from the ground up with a new rule attached to every purchase order. Any flagged concern, however small, required sign-off from an independent safety reviewer before a decision could move forward. Renata didn't soften as a leader. She stayed exact, demanding, unwilling to accept vague answers, the same as always. What changed was who she pointed those qualities at. She called Desmond herself, not through an assistant, and asked what it would take to keep him close to the company permanently.
He turned down the executive title she offered. He agreed instead to a limited advisory role, one built around his schedule, one that let him keep picking Nora up from the train station on weekends and rebuilding old parts in his workshop on Tuesdays. If you've stayed with this story, you already understand why moments like this matter. Consider subscribing. We build these carefully because the people who deserve recognition rarely ask for it themselves. Months later, a photograph arrived at his workshop, no note attached, just an aircraft rebuilt to specification and a name written on the back that finally matched what everyone on that tarmac had learned the hard way.